Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Laila Rasmi, an assistant professor at the University of Texas Health Science Center School of Biomedical Informatics. And I would like to welcome you to this session, Improving Nurse Staffing Schedules Using Responsible and Ethical Machine Learning, part of the HEMS AI/ML session series. Before we begin, please keep in mind the handout will be available for this session, and you can access it via the HEMS 23 mobile app by navigating to the session details page for this session, where you can access the handout. The evaluation for this session is also located on the same session details page by clicking on the Survey tab. We ask that you please complete the evaluation because your feedback is instrumental in helping HEMS continue to deliver quality educational content. Finally, you may also claim continuing education credits in the mobile app by tapping on the 3-bar menu icon on the top left hand of the screen. Select About HEMS 23 and Discover and Continuing Education Credits. You also can claim the credit by visiting the Professional Development page on the conference website and navigate to the Continuing Education Credits. Now, I'd like to introduce our speakers joining us on the stage today. Kiskil Kaur, Executive Director, Clinical Performance Improvement, Indiana University Health. Dr. Tim Elwell, Global Advisory Services Leader, Healthcare and Life Sciences. One TV, I hope I say the name correct, Incorporation. Carrie Hoffman, Project Manager, Nursing Innovation, IU Health. Please join me in extending a warm welcome to our speakers.
Thank you, everyone, for joining. My name is Keith. We'll go ahead and get started here. And I'll tell you, the three of us are, get the timer going. Thank you, Tim. Struggling with sitting down and talk. I'm kind of like, got to get up and talk to you, so we may go back and forth a little bit today and keep it a little bit informal. Hope you'll bear with us. But thanks for coming. We have a good talk, we think, on some work we're doing on nurse staffing and ML and how all that stuff ties together. We'll go into that momentarily. But I want to tell you first, we have no conflicts of interest at all to talk about amongst any of the three of us. I'll keep up with the slides here. The agenda for today is as follows. Done a very good job here, haven't I? A little bit of introduction to the problem that we're talking about here and what we want to go through. And then we'll talk about the challenges, the gaps, problem statement, those types of things, and what we saw as the challenge as we entered into it. A little bit about goals, in other words, what we wanted to achieve going out of this, and I would put those probably in achievements and concepts more so than like specific goals, although we'll talk about specifics a little bit. We'll talk some about machine learning, a little bit about the significance of how this worked out for our nursing team, and then also a comment on lessons learned. And we didn't have it on the slide here, but I also want to state out loud, and we'll cover it again at the end, that we want to have time for questions at the end, so we'll leave plenty of time. We would welcome questions about what we've done, including challenges, right? Like, hey, how are you going to handle this? Have you thought about this so far? Or, hey, we tried this, and here's what doesn't work about that. We would welcome that because we think we can make it better with that. And last but not least, we are in process on this work. It's not a final product. But we do have it in production in some pilot units, but it's not final yet, so it's a work in process. So, objectives for today, I would like to just talk a little bit about how at least we understand workload on a nursing unit in a hospital and what the drivers are to get to that workload. A little bit about how we've approached change management and what I'll refer to as a customer-centric approach to building that, right? A kind of a product development approach or agile approach. People use different names for that. And last but not least, like I talked about, the lessons learned, what we think we've found so far, and maybe what we expect to come in the coming weeks and months. Next up is just a little bit of a slide about IU Health here, just to give some perspective and context about what we're talking about, right? IU Health is probably a pretty typical IDN system. We got primary care, specialty care, home care, hospice care, urgent care, a health insurance plan, all those types of things, right? So we have a little bit of everything. We do not have any long-term care in our system. And probably the most important part about that systemness for us to talk about today is that we focused only on hospitals, right, and hospital units. We excluded the ED, we excluded behavioral health, labor and delivery, a few of those types of scenarios, and focused just on floor units, if you will. And so a little more about that perspective is the types of hospitals and units we have are community hospitals, or formerly called rural access hospitals, community hospitals, community access hospitals, then community hospitals, which are anywhere from probably 3 to 350 beds or so. Then we have an academic hospital, which is 800 beds plus. And then we also have our freestanding children's hospital. So that's a little bit about the context that we work in. Some folks have asked, hey, are you doing this in a little 100-bed hospital, or are you doing it in something giant? We're attempting to build this out to do it in any of those, right? We think the concept is universal, and if we can figure it out, then we can expand it from there. So what's the challenge that we're faced with? A little bit of a starting point here, and set the stage is this. We began this during the next to last wave of COVID in our region, in our state anyway. So things were pretty tough. And you guys are probably all in the same spot, right? With not only were challenges overall, but challenges particularly with nurse staffing during that time. And so our chief nurse executive came to us, myself and someone else, and said, hey, can you help us out? We said, sure, what do you got in mind? And he said, we got to have a better way to have visibility into what's going on with nursing. And kind of the cute little phrase that we have repeated is, he said, look, McDonald's knows when they're cooking fries and who's on fries. We got to be able to tell in nursing, like, who's there, right? What are we doing? How much do we need? And can we have any visibility into that, right? So we set down a path to try to figure that out. And honestly, when you start out with something like that, many of you probably know, you don't actually know what the problem is. You know what the pain point is, and that was the pain point. Hey, we're way short on staffing. Can you help us work this out? Can we get some visualization? Can we get anything real time? And he gave us a couple of parameters. One is, I don't want anything to do with acuity. I've implemented 3 acuity tools before. They are challenges for various reasons. I don't want anything to do with acuity, and I don't want my RNs filling out any paperwork or forms. All right, so that was kind of the guardrails, what we had to start with. So it's really a pretty open field. And we started down the path of just making sure that we scoped it to get some work done. And I mentioned before, we scoped it just to hospital units. And I'll state the obvious, we did not have a solution. To my knowledge, there's not a solution that we think we've developed in the marketplace. So we were out to start to figure out what exact problem are we trying to solve, and can we build something to make it work. We came up with a model that works something like this. We have kind of what we call a baseline for the work in a hospital on a unit, and that comes in terms of level of care, right? You've got either an ICU, or a progressive care unit, or a med-surg unit, right, generally speaking. And we think there's a certain level of care that the nursing team provides, their professional practice standards, right, that they take care of in those types of environments and arenas. But then we think on top of that, there are 3 layers, right? So there's the base layer, then 3. The first on top of that is what we call the medical layer, or the physician order layer, right? So we have a base level of work, but then you add work based depending on what the physician is requiring or requesting, right, via orders. The next layer up, so imagine this, if you will, with me. The foundation's the same. You're in a med-surg unit. You have the same 2 patients, same diagnoses, same order sets. Everything's the same, right? So the workload is the same at that point, right? If you come up to the next level, what we call patient characteristics, then you can have some differences there, right? So for instance, the first 2 layers are the same, but one of those 2 patients is blind, does not speak the language that the nurse speaks, and is not ambulatory. Those are very, very significant impacts to workload on a nursing unit. And so then the 3rd layer is what we call social characteristics. There are other things, and if there are nurses in the room, you know this very well, that can be involved there too, right? You can have things like the patient is under arrest, or the patient has restrictive orders against someone or some family member, or this is an 80-year-old person who has no family members at all to take care of them, so there's no one coming in and helping and working through things, and certainly when they go home, there's no transportation to get there, or any way to help get them to another appointment to do anything else, right? So there are multiple layers there that impact what the workload is. So we wanted to give you that kind of background. We'll now start to talk through things and go into some other details, but that's the foundation that we've taken. Carrie? Yeah.
So I'm going to talk to you a little bit regarding various approaches to solving the nursing staffing challenge. And so on here you'll have 6 different approaches that has historically been utilized. Professional judgment, back in the 1970s, there was Telford model. It's basically utilizing expert opinion to develop a staffing plan specific to a unit. Not a whole lot of data approach to it. And then you have benchmarking. We have benchmarking throughout healthcare. It is one that we utilize within IU Health as far as NDNQI, which is the national database for nursing quality indicators. And still, when you are talking about benchmarking, you're bringing in like data or like units, so it seems more objective, but still you have that professional or expert opinion around what you're actually starting with. The next one is volume-based approaches. So this is one that we see a lot within the United States. It is looking at patient-nurse ratios. This is one in particular that we utilize at IU Health, and you'll hear hours per patient day referenced. So how much time are nurses and nursing assistants having to expel in order to, on a unit, take care of a patient per day, correct? Well, that is only looking at one particular set in time. So for us in particular, we're looking at censuses usually at midnight because they're not changing as much. But when you really think about it, hours per patient day is not capturing really workload that's having to come through admissions, transfers, discharges, all of those other factors that are adding on to what is going on within that unit. So while it's volume-based, it's adding in a layer of data. It's really not fluid with what's going on a nursing unit. The next three approaches, patient prototypes, the multifactorial indicators, and time tasks, is another step in trying to look at, okay, can we bring in patient information in order to help us get a little bit closer to what staffing may look like. For instance, the Safer Nursing Care tool will actually pull in patient characteristics on a 1 through 5 acuity scale and utilizes a multiplier, again, trying to help us identify what does it really take to take care of our patients. So we think about, here we have professional judgment, then we have data around volume, but then how do you really pull in the patient information to indicate what do we need from a workload perspective? For us in particular, even though we utilize hours per patient day, we do use NDNQI as far as a benchmarking, but look at all the layers. It starts to become more and more complex because you're not just doing one anymore, you're having to pull it all together, try to make this perfect picture of how you staff. The other thing is too, you heard from Keith that, hey, we've trialed 3 different acuity tools. Okay, when we start breaking down acuity tools, guess what? It has to be inputted by nurses that are supposed to be taking care of patients. And then what we see a lot of time is charge nurses are then having to collect that information to actually make equitable assignments and be able to staff their units, sometimes every 4 hours. Talk about a waste of time when really you're just trying to take care of patients just to staff your units. And so, go ahead, next slide.
Sorry.
So our call to arms. Now, I am sitting up here because I'm a project manager in nursing innovation, and back in October 2022, I started working with an 18-bed, what we'd call an acuity adaptable unit. So we take medical and progressive level of care, and we were challenged with come up with a brand new model of care. Great. So we started trying different things. Guess what? What I kept hearing over and over again, how are we supposed to measure this? Or, I am trying to do different types of modeling regarding what our nurse and our tech ratios are, but when you get it really, really small margins of tipping that scale, they kept on saying it's too much. Well, why is it too much? Nothing that we were doing was actually measurable. So when I heard about this tool and what we were trying to create, I said, this is what we need. This is perfect. Give me something that allows me to actually take the time that we nurses have to take at multiple levels, and let's trial it. Let's pilot it to see what it shows our nurses, and if is there correlation, because our nurses are asking for it. They too were over the acuity tools. When it really got down to it and they're taking care of patients, if they ran out of time, that was the thing that went to the wayside. And they were more huddling around how were they going to staff their unit. The other thing that I want to share with you is, we just talked about 6 different approaches specific to how we staff, which really comes down to budget. But there's a lot of other things that we're going to have to consider besides the hours per patient day, and that can be, when it comes down to it, taking care of patients, if you don't have staff to do your ancillary, so who's staffing dietary, who's staffing transport, who's staffing respiratory, when they're not staffed, who does it fall on? It falls on those that are taking care of the patient at the bedside. And so all of those factors actually play a huge part that really are not factored into hours per patient day. And so that was something else. Here in a few minutes, I'm going to be talking about our current state and our future state is this has to be multidiscipline. It can no longer be just nursing specific, but how do we actually look at the workload and break out who's taking what and how are we taking care of the patients? The excellent thing too is I was excited to see through this is that we're actually utilizing our own technology in order to help us and make it easier for nurses, which we have to do. We have to start utilizing the technology that we have. So Keith, why don't you share a little bit more about our problem?
Thank you. So the next slide here was an original slide that we scratched out just to kind of frame up the problem, right? A lot of you guys probably do that, it's either a scoping document or some kind of an A3 or something like that. And that's all we were trying to do here is just say that, hey, at the end of the day, we're not matching up the supply of nursing that we have with the work that's required, right? Some people call that staffing to demand or whatever phrase you want to use. We weren't matching that up well. And what we found was that the current state for us was, as you would expect, and you may be experiencing the same things, we're pretty inconsistent, not necessarily accurate. It takes a long time. It requires people to input lots of things, and we can't get everything we need in the same place. And so what we set out to do was just to sort of maybe not completely hit the easy button, but make it fast and simple for a nurse to get what she needs. Generally speaking, that's a charge nurse, and we'll come back to that later, to begin to understand what's going on. And when you think about system-wise, the kind of the wacky blue drawing we have over there just illustrates it. And we have a timekeeping system. All you guys have one of those too, right? And we also have an ERP, that's Enterprise Resource Planning System. For us, our HR system is in there. I probably should have labeled that the HR system. So we're trying to figure out who's here and what information do we have about them in terms of their qualifications and capabilities. And that's the staffing side, or the input side, if you will. The demand side is, hey, wait a minute, who's here? We have information from our EHR. We also have a bid management system. And how do we marry that stuff together and make those talk to each other, right? So we can begin to hone in on what's the actual demand, what's the workload. We chose to use the term workload versus demand. It resonated better a little bit. So what's the workload and how do we staff to that? And that's all this is just intended to demonstrate. And what we found was, as you begin to work through that, you got to understand, okay, well, what customer are we trying to serve? The original request came from an executive vice president, right? And that's great, that's good. I'm glad that we had that level of support. But as we talk through what's going on, you have to understand, well, who is actually using the data at what point in time as you try to solve the problem and figure out who do we serve. And so we have the senior executive level folks, chief nurse officers, right? You guys all have those too, CNOs, directors who are doing all kinds of reporting and analysis and that sort of thing. We have what we call AAs, or administrative assistants, or house managers, right? Charge nurses and the nurses on the unit. And what we figured out was we really need to hone in on the folks on the floor, right? Those charge nurses who are actually making the assignments and understanding what the workload is at every shift change. For us, 7A, 7P generally. Every time we make that flip, somebody's got to be looking at that and kind of figure out, okay, what is the demand, what's the workload we have in front of us, and how we're going to staff that. And that really has to be solved, in our opinion, at the frontline level, because from there, you guys know the routine, you can roll everything up from there. Carrie?
Yeah. So here outlines a little bit regarding our current state and what we consider our future vision. And in the green bar, you'll notice some key attributes that we really wanted to focus on to understand where are we currently and where we want to end up. What is this going to help us do? So in our current state, everything was very fixed. And so we just talked about our staffing approaches. It came down to nurse ratios, what were we budgeted for, based off our benchmarks. And the thing is, when you put it in that framework and you have frontline nurses or charge nurses trying to make staffing decisions, it's rigid. And units are not rigid. They have to be very fluid. It's ever changing. And so the other thing is too, a lot of our data was lagging. So they can't even make great decisions based off the data that we're presenting them, or it's very difficult for them to get the information that they need to make smart decisions. What does this lead to? It leads out to nursing burnout. We don't have nurses begging at our door to do charge nurse positions. And so really, we're doing ourselves a disservice from that aspect of we're not making it as easy as possible for those having to make those frontline decisions. So in our future vision, it was very important for us to make sure that it is fluid, that we are able to be proactive in our decisions. It's no longer looking at what is going on right now, but how can I utilize the data that I have, either in real time or in real quick iterations to make those informed decisions, and also too, how to be proactive. So how can I utilize that information to even be thinking further forward than what we've ever thought before from our staffing decisions and our workload. The other thing is too, I had mentioned this before, is we wanted to expand regarding who this was touching. So our non-nursing staff, our ancillary staff, how and what can they do? How do we elevate their roles? That's going to be significantly important in model of care changes. And so we've got to take into consideration how do we break that out and what is that workload by each multiple discipline. So that was our vision. We knew those key components had to be a part of what we were building.
So next up, to talk about the goals that we set out to accomplish, which these are probably not going to be too surprising to you. Really, we got to figure out how to get the right resources in the right place at the right time. That's not original for us, right? That's something we're all trying to do. We've had to figure out how do we make this thing more flexible, right? It's got to move and flow with what's going on in the system, what's happening. In other words, it has to be dynamic and as close to real time as we can possibly get it. In the next to last line there, we certainly can't ignore the benchmarks, right? Those are out there, and we would probably debate with some of those benchmarks that they don't go down to a deep enough level to understand what's actually happening on the workload with the drivers of the units. And we think we're helping get that, but we can't ignore those, right? We have to work within those frameworks. Nobody's going to let us blow those up, at least not at this point. And then we got to realize value, right, for the end customer. At the end of the day, no matter what any of us do in terms of process or business or bedside care or we're writing ML or code or anything else, we got to deliver value to the customer. And that's how we're set out to measure ourselves. Are we bringing value to the home team? And if we are, then we got something we can work with. Tim, you're up.
So now we're going to turn left to the technology side of the equation here to talk a little bit about kind of how we made the sausage, and also share with you some insights as to lessons learned throughout that process. So Quantify, my company, is a AI-first digital engineering company. We've been working with IU Health now for a couple of years and just have enjoyed the partnership. And I will tell you that the top of that, above the line there are the things that we had worked on to be able to kind of harmonize all of the data in their infrastructure to be able to get to that magical data liquidity goal, so that we could actually begin to derive insights into the data. We had already put in place 3 or so use cases that are in production today, which are kind of cool. But this was the first use case that we used or that we were demonstrating a machine learning capability. So what I want to talk to you about a little bit about how that also happened. I will tell you on the left-hand side, bottom left, on the harmonization of the HD, that took about a month and a half. Some people ask, well, how long does it take? Does it take years? And, well, no, it took about a month and a half, right, to be able to work with IU Health to be able to get all the data. We had to get data from ERP systems and from bed management systems and from EHR systems and from time tracking systems. They're all disparate data. One of the comments that was first made about, well, why are you guys even entering this digital strategy? They said, listen, Tim, we got over 1,000 applications in our infrastructure, and they're all perfectly designed to do exactly what they're doing, but they were never designed to be able to talk together, right? So being able to get this data over into this neutral platform really kind of, unveiled or discovered what was actually happening. And this particular use case was a great example of how that all has come together. On the creation of the ML model, that took about 3 or 4 months or so for us to be able to actually work it out. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And then after we did that, then we deployed the models. Just understand, although we have 16 hospitals at IU Health infrastructure, we're talking about a subset of those 4 hospitals in this particular case. And we've deployed deployed them to those 4 hospitals and looking at continuing to refine them. If we could go to the next slide. So this is kind of the process flow. On the left-hand side is, the data that we looked at. Some of the data we used, some of the data we threw out. We just didn't, throughout our process, we identified, where there were some correlations and where there weren't. And we identified what worked and what didn't. I will tell you that, certainly ADT feeds, historical data, seasonality, all that stuff was absolutely critical for us to be able to come up with a prediction model. So you get into ADT components, but then the secret sauce in this particular one, which was really the major work driver, right, is around orders. Think about it. An order represents an amount of work. Right? So think about what we created was, we were 29 different order sets, and each one of them have their own level of complexity and also resides in different places in the EHR and other places in the enterprise. We had to find them, we had to do that mapping, we had to harmonize that, we put that into the data lake. It also, it was incumbent upon us to take those orders, right, and then come up with a discrete time allocated for every order in that set. So that once we identify the order for Keith, right, who's, in an ICU bed, compared, with Carrie, right, in a med-surg unit, the order sets are going to be different. Well, the time associated with the deployment of each of those orders is also different. Right? And then things like administration, right? The administration of the orders are different, and so there's a fair amount of complexity to be able to kind of get that table right. And frankly, that table I expect will evolve over time. In fact, we identified that, we did a great job for adult, right? Peds are kind of a different model, right? So we'll have to create another table for peds. Anyway, those things being said, we also looked at other things like ICD-10 codes, right? Just trying to understand if ICD-10 groupings, and the sequela of different types of orders for a particular type of patient, diabetic patient with CHF, might that sequela, where that workload be something that would be predictable? We came to the conclusion that in this particular case, it didn't fit into the model because it exacerbated the error. However, it doesn't mean that it won't be used in the future. Days of the week are different, right? Saturday, Sundays are different than Mondays or Tuesdays, right? So we began to take a look at that and the seasonality associated. We also looked at external types of features, things like weather, right? If you have a snowstorm in Indianapolis, chances are that somebody is going to have a hard time getting to work, right? So can we use that as an example of another predictor to be able to support this? And pandemic, by the way, we're in a pandemic, right? Did that have any impact, on the overall data? Well, yes, it did. So question here is, what are the impacts and how can we tweak the models? After we got all that information, pushed it over, did some fancy manipulation in some data processing. When you get over to the data forecasting side for the wonks in the room, we looked at 8 different types of ML models. What's really interesting about it is that they're not handled discreetly. We ultimately, this is one of our lessons learned, right? It's not just, one of those 8 that we used and we kind of locked and loaded. Initially, we thought we had it. And then up until a couple weeks ago, we said, oh, crap, we actually we can manage this differently by using an ensemble method. And I'm going to talk about that in just a second. We also looked at different approaches. One approach was kind of forecasting workload based on historical orders, which is ultimately what we agreed on. But we also looked at batching. And I will tell you that between approach 1 and approach 2, we actually came up with a hybrid between approach 1 and approach 2, because we started to see that in individual work efforts, workloads, that there are characteristic spikes that are similar in other units. So we began to take those similarities and begin to group them into different model categories. So we actually are using 5 different types of models, but with a variety, and there's a preponderance of most of it kind of aggregating in one particular model. Anyway, after you have all that stuff, now you have opportunities to create some sexy, dashboards, and frankly, what's happening now is some of the work has been shifting over to other tools, like being able to visualize how to schedule or assign nurses, in a particular unit. So that's one of the projects now. That was an unintended consequence. We love that as a vendor, but but that being the case, there's good opportunities for us to be able to continue to improve and refine. Anyway, so why don't we go to the next slide? So we're getting into kind of the weeds a little bit. I'm going to go through this really quickly. The takeaway here is that this is a process. This is a process, right? We started with 4 models, right? We went to another 4 models. We started to see what the relationships of the models are. We ran thousands and thousands of iterations of what-if types of scenarios to come up with the best fit, best combination of outputs. And there's something called a MAPE score. That's the mean absolute predictive error. MAPE scores are how we determine if we're doing the right thing. How close to the pin are we getting to the right answer? And I will kind of hold where we're ultimately on the MAPE score in just a second. But we're also going into other types of models that have features. Features associated with the model are how we're kind of locking and loading on which particular units have different type of discrete characteristics. And it comes out that the days of the week are a really important characteristic. We also know that things happen differently on holidays. But we were able to mathematically prove that. Now we also looked at that 5th iteration where we started to throw weather and some other external information into it, and we started to kind of coagulate or coordinate all of our resources on one model, this XGBoost model, and we thought we had it solved, right? Well, not so much. We had to go back and say, well, and I'll hold that powder dry just for a second. We also looked at, when we looked at the 4 hospitals were comprised of 50 different units. And each of the units were different by a little bit. So we had to kind of tweak each of those particular models, and we call it hyperparameter tuning. Anyway, then we started to build out those models and created features around it, and then we did some validation. So if we can go to the next slide. I wanted to show this to you just to kind of help you visualize how we approached the problem. In this particular case, this is when we thought we had it all locked up, and we said that this XGBoost, and holiday model was the right model. Well, lo and behold, it wasn't. However, what happened was we did the same thing with the other models. You can see on the left-hand side, Unit A, you can see with that there's actual, right, which is kind of the that blue line, right, and then you see the gold, which is the predictive line, and how they were really disparate. They weren't tracking very well. Very high MAPE rates, actually over 35%. But as you can see, right, if I go from left to right to the current model performance, we're tracking really well in that predictive capability to help the nurse understand what will be there in the next 4 hours, 8 hours, 12 hours, 24 hours. Oh, next week. Oh, 6 weeks down the line. Right? All of those things are what we're trying to get to be able to say, oh, let's take the time tracking estimate that you had created 6 weeks in advance and bump that up against what the predictive model is to see what the gaps are. So at least there's now a capability of being able to accurately predict what we're going to have to prepare for. If you go to the next slide. So this is a fancy slide that talks about, kind of what is actually happening. If you're looking at kind of that, the patient against the orders, right, that's a pretty simple problem to solve, right? That's a rules-based approach, right, where, I know who's on the floor, right? Now I got to predict who's coming in the door, right? And more importantly, not only who's coming in the door, but who's on the floor is going to be in a day. Right, and what type of support they're going to need from a demand perspective, and ultimately how many nurses have to be staffed to be able to support them in a safe way. So on the left-hand side, you can see that that's kind of the predictive model, and it starts right high, and it goes down low over time. Why is that important? Well, we know that the rules-based approach right up front is going to probably be the most accurate assessment as to what the work requirement is. But as that starts to go over time, it degrades, right? Because now you have to have some sort of algorithmic approach to be able to support, what will happen tomorrow, right? That's where the ML model kind of kicks in. Anyway, so we started at this MAPE around 35%, and we got it down to something less than that, and we ultimately came up with a VAR model, all right, which is kind of a regression model, and we kind of compared that with this LSTM model, which is really kind of a neural network type of model. Really cool stuff. And what it did is, when we started with that LSTM model, we said we threw it out. And we threw it out because, well, it took about 8 hours to run that model. We had 50 units to be able to kind of calculate. Well, that was kind of untenable, so we kind of threw that out. We went back to it because when we combined it with the VAR model, instead of looking at a linear type of approach, serial approach where we kind of have to do it 1 unit out at a time, the VAR model permitted us to be able to do things simultaneously. We're now able to develop all of the models, run all of the models for all of the 50 units in less than 15 minutes. Right, which now gives us the opportunity to give real-time data back to the nurses, and it was kind of cool too because we were also able to take the time tracking systems and we tracked click in and click out times of the nurses, so we knew exactly how many nurses were on the unit at any time to be able to say, oh, you're okay, or no, you're not, hello. So we keep on going down here, and we were able to do these predictions. Well, lo and behold, we got a MAPE. I told the guys. I told these guys, I said, we had our crew running over the weekend, right, to be able to say, I said, you're going to give an international talk today. And we want to be able to kind of brag about the performance. So you guys got to get your MAPE down. And last week it was around 14%. We're now down below 10%, which, by the way, wasn't a key factor or success factor that was identified by the nurses, but was one of the things that we agreed on. We said, we got to set a target. Our target is under 10% MAPE. So we were able to get it to 8%. So we're pretty proud of that, and I'll tell you what that means in real terms in just a second. If we go to the next slide, and I'm almost done here. So our insights relative to what we did, and well, we figured out that within this these prediction or these actual orders, right, order sets for a particular unit, there's a lot of variability. So we had to go in there and do a lot of pre-processing to be able to take out a lot of the noise, to be able to understand what the true cycles within that particular processing of that particular unit look like. Well, lo and behold, we found out that there are a lot of similarities, right, between different unit types. So we started to kind of cluster those units and put them together and be able to apply different types of model sets. And then we took this multi-layer approach, which is kind of cool. It's an ensemble method. In other words, we were taking all those 8 different models, and we were able to take the best and brightest of each of those 8 models to be able to put it together, come up with the best approach. And then after we did that, it was kind of an artificial outcome. We had to then use some bias correction, because bias correction is kind of getting things back to where they really are. And it also helps with over prediction stuff, kind of brings things back to the mean for us to be able to make those accurate assessments. Anyway, all said and done, we found out, and understand, we took about 5 years or so of data, right? So we had a ton of data, right, that we pulled over, and we were learning from it. Well, lo and behold, after we had gone through these things thousands and thousands of times, that we determined that there were 14 lags that were needed for us to be able to predict this week's predictions. Lag, what is lag? A lag is a week, right? So 14 weeks right back for us to be able to estimate what's going to happen in the next 4 hours, next 8 hours, next 24 hours, this week and also next week. Now, we also looked at it, we said, all right, well, if we went out a little bit further, right, say 6 weeks, which, by the way, the time tracking system gives us a 6 weeks view, right, of this schedule, right? How long do we have to go back on that? It was 21 weeks. The good news is that it's not 5 years, right? So that's kind of cool. So it gives us more of an idea of the efficiency of the model. And the last thing is, this is what I'm most proud of, is that outside of being able to work with my compatriots here, is that MAPE equivalent, right, that 8% is equivalent to about a full-time equivalent per unit. That's the error rate that we're down to now. So it's pretty cool. We're getting close to the pin. We'll never be there perfectly, but we're getting closer. And it's providing, again, going back to Carrie's comments, an accurate way of being able to predict work. One of the things that we're now talking to the nursing staff on from the research perspective is work is great. Burden is also what we want to look at. So that's going to be the next big challenge. But that's where we are now, and I think we're going into kind of wrapping it up.
Yep. So project significance, I want to talk about this some. So I had shared with you, I was asking for, here I am challenged with model of care. I had our medical diabetes unit, which medical progressive mix, and we know from a staffing ratios, Acuity adaptable models are really difficult from a staffing ratio because it changes. You have different percentages of progressive versus medical. And so they were asking, let us try it. What does this look like? And so mid-December 2022, we deployed the first initiation of this model or this dashboard. And when we did that, we actually also deployed an emotional survey, because we had heard from nurses of, hey, the first 2 pilots that we did around our staffing mix was emotional. They were burnt. They were like, we don't want to do this anymore. And I'm like, okay, let's try this because this is what you're asking for, but let's actually put an emotional component to it. So if you leave at the end of your shift and you are emotionally exhausted, I want to know about it and I want to know why. You have to give me an answer. And so it was interesting to see, Keith was talking about layers. So when we deployed it, we only had the technical layer, the level of care, and the technical layer, which was the orders. And so when I started getting these emotional surveys, they're like, hey, something's missing. Like, we're seeing these numbers, but something's missing. And so it was like, I literally walked on the floor. We had 3 days of emotional, hey, we're having a rough day. Over half of our unit had isolation patients. Guess what that does to nursing workload? So I'm like, that's it. So then I went back to Keith and his team and I'm like, hey, we're missing something here. We're missing isolation patients. And so I'm like, team, great catch, give me more. So as they were actually giving us some detail regarding why they're feeling burnt out from their workload, we literally were able to take that back to Keith's team and say, hey, you are right in line with that next level of patient characteristics, because now I have isolation patients, I have patients that are requiring pain medications frequently, or I have a patient that has a high BMI that needs 2 assists getting up, and that is all adding to the workload of the nurses that we have never quantified. So right now we're in the process of developing that next layer, and it's actually utilizing our nursing documentation. I mean, what greater way to drive good documentation if you document it, time is given back to the actual workload of that patient. So it's been very interesting to see as, they originally identified the problem, they identified the future version. That's exactly what our nurses continue to want to see as they actually trialed the workload tool. So the other nice thing is really taken out it being so subjective. It's taken the workload out from the nurses that are doing the bedside care. And while they're very emotional and willing to share what was impacting them, it was very easy for us to start seeing as nursing leader what is actually workload driven, and also to what is being driven by some of those other factors of ancillary support versus newer, younger nurses. We all know that we're really going to be challenged over the next 5 years regarding our experience. So you have a nurse that's 15 years experience versus one that is 2. It looks very different regarding the perception of their workload and how they're taking care of patients. It also helped us identify duplicates. So, when we're talking about orders, we're going to have to really be aware of duplicate orders and some of how we manage those order sets within our own, but they shouldn't be there anyway. So basically, it just highlighted something that we need to continue to work on and get better at. And then the other thing is gaining visibility to the types of labor that is needed. I mean, this played perfectly into when I'm trying to look at models of care, how can I actually identify orders or work that's being documented or driven that can actually be performed outside of a registered nurse by another discipline. And so that is something that we continue to work on and adjust to see how we can make it work better for us. Lessons learned.
Yep.
So when we deployed this on our first unit, I am now overseeing 3 different units. 2 of them are still acuity adaptable units. The 3rd unit we just deployed to is a critical access hospital that does have fixed or minimal staffing. And so we wanted to see how it kind of played a little bit differently in that type of atmosphere. But the thing is, when you present this information to nurses, it's not new. It's a different way of looking at it. But from that aspect, they grasp it very quickly. Literally looking at 30 minutes of training, more than anything, explaining the why, and thinking more about the behavioral management of bringing awareness to, hey, we see that this is an issue. We're trying to take something off your plate. They're like, great, tell me more about it. How do I use it? And that's actually where we identified an assignment tool. Instead of charge nurses carrying around sheets of paper that are telling them who has what and what's going on with their patients, how can we actually feed some of this information into an assignment tool that they can easily adapt to and not have to enter numbers themselves? It's just another layer to it. And so from nursing's perspective, there's definitely a pull, and it's nice to hear from, at least from my region, since we have 3 units, I now have nursing managers and nursing directors, even house officers who are having to do multi-staff assignments saying, hey, I want to see the workload for that unit, because if I only have 5 nurses to place, that workload can actually inform me where I need to place those nurses. So a lot of different uses that it can actually show for our whole hospital.
A couple other things I'll add to this are, one of them is, I'm a non-technical person, right? But I'll tell you this, the technical stuff that Tim described, it's pretty detailed, right? But it's this big. The change management part was more like this big, right? And you guys have probably all seen that. We can design the most perfect, awesome tool in the world, but if we don't go through the change management part, it's never gonna work. So we have spent a lot of time on that. I don't think we're perfect at it, but it has helped a ton. And I would say that comes in 2 shapes. One is change management at the front line where the nurses are, right? Telling them ahead of time, walking through them, getting right there with them and going through things. But also it's a change for our IT shop. Your shop may be different than ours, but ours was described as a pretty typical waterfall shop, right? So taking an approach of looking at what's the customer need and allowing them to be highly engaged and define that has been a change for us that we're kind of working through. So that is the end of our prepared remarks here. We wanted to leave time for questions and comments here. We actually hope that there are questions, including, by the way, any challenges you have with the work that we're doing. We'd like to learn from you. So we're all set and fire away. Unless I think you have some administrative comments.
Yeah, so just like before we begin the question and answer, please remember to take a few minutes to evaluate this session via the session detail page on the mobile app for improving nurse staffing schedules using responsible and ethical machine learning. Thank you. Now, if you have questions, please come to the aisle microphone so everyone can hear your questions. Thank you.
Hi. Question for you on the assignment tool. Is it currently in use?
Yes.
When you have the assignment tool, are you looking, you mentioned multi-unit views on that. Are you looking at that in your overall model to understand whether or not is having an impact on your contract labor across multiple units as well?
So I don't think we have looked at it from that scope yet. I think right now, because we do have contract labor by unit, we're looking more at our resource pool usage. And so for us, we have our resource pool, some is regional, some is at a system perspective. And so we are not, our end goal is to reduce the contract labor, but this is really helping us identify kind of that real-time staffing conversation. And to be honest, that's where it's really nice from the workload tool, because it's giving you a way to have those conversations that weren't there in the past.
Good question, thank you. Next up.
A bit of a philosophical question, but this is the 3rd session I've been to on a similar topic. So what do you think we can do to not have to reinvent the wheel across the country or across the globe to fix this problem?
Who wants to go?
I'll take a first stab at it. Before we began the project, I did I wouldn't say it's necessarily comprehensive, but I put a pretty detailed literature search on this type of approach using machine learning for demand scheduling. Understand, again, you have the supply side and the demand side. And we were focused right on the demand side. I wasn't able to find anything else in the literature. If you can point us to others that are doing something in a similar way, we'd like to talk to them as well, because we haven't seen that yet.
We have had a question come up of, hey, isn't your timekeeping system doing the same thing as this? And our response to that would be, no, absolutely not. It's at the unit level, and it's generally speaking ratios oriented, and maybe a few other modifications. This is literally at the patient level. So the path we're heading down, it isn't going to matter. We think about acuity adaptable units. That's not going to matter to us with this tool. But to answer your question about how do we get there for the industry, so to speak, I don't know, but I'd love for us to do that.
I would also add that we can also see improvements on the supply side, right? Being able to use linear programming as an example to be able to optimize the type of staff that would be used at any given time. Being able to marry that component from a prediction with a prediction capability on the demand side, I think would be a deal changer. I really do. I think we could improve the way we schedule. And also the type of resources that are scheduled. You want to just mention that too?
Yeah, so with nursing, go ahead.
Yeah, so actually with some of our model of care changes, we were really trying to do some staffing ratios. Really, when you have a 5 and 2 model, why can't you do like a 4 and 3 model? Or even what if you did a 3 and 4 model?
Can you explain that?
So for a acuity adaptable unit, when we benchmark for Indian QI 18-bed unit, we normally have 5 nurses, 2 techs for 18 beds. And so we actually piloted our first 8 weeks was, can we actually do 3 nurses and 4 or 5 techs and actually switch. And that was where we heard there are some nurses that could actually take 6 medical progressive level of patients, and they were perfectly fine. It is when they had a catastrophic event, so if they had a patient that turned and was going down, or they needed to go up in their level of care, that's when it tipped the scale. And so we asked ourselves, okay, in those instances, when can you actually pull in a 4th nurse to help cover for a period of time, instead of having to go back to the fact of I need to have a 5 nurse 2 tech ratio all the time. And that is where the workload tool is very helpful, because if I can get this every 30 minutes and it's projecting off what I'm documenting and what I have as far as orders, I can actually begin asking myself of, hey, I know at 7 to 11 p.m. right now, 7A to 11 A and 7P to 11P, our workforce is completely overloaded. We are killing our own selves because we're not level loading what we do for our nurses at particular times. What this has actually showed us is it actually validates that, and so now we're asking ourselves, what do we do in the unit and what do we do differently to then start level loading that? Or we have to actually be much more nimble with our staffing and either upstaff or downstaff during different times. And so that is where, when we talk about staffing ratios, it's not just 5 and 2. It has to become a very fluid, but you gotta have something that informs you in order to be able to do that. The thing that I love regarding MDU right now is that they've been doing it long enough that they're coming to me and saying, hey, I'm walking into this number and I know what kind of day I'm gonna have. Now they're asking me, okay, now that I know what kind of day I'm gonna have, what are we gonna do different? Because now, they've seen how bad it can get. They've now seen how the data can help them. They're asking me, what are we going to do different? Like, how are we going to actually staff differently from this? And we've brought in our other departments. So we've been working with pharmacy, PT, respiratory therapy, and we're deploying other initiatives that's actually going to start level loading. So if you can imagine, we're going to level load and we're going to start looking at doing, flexible staffing, even if we could do it more than 4-hour blocks. Like, that's what excites me. Like, that is true innovation in healthcare. So.
Good question, thank you. Next up.
Yeah, I had a question about if you iterated or tried different approaches on determining what the source of truth was, how you went about deciding what to predict and compare against.
Really good question. In fact, one of the criticisms, I guess, if you will, from the nurses was, that table you put together for the amount of time per order, how'd you calculate that? And frankly, it was really more from an empirical perspective, right? Where, we had the IU Health folks, Brian and Keith and others that were actually going and speaking to nurses and saying, is this about right? Does this seem to be correct? I will expect that will continue to kind of change over time, particularly as technology changes, right, and different administration capabilities are. However, with that said, I think that the truth, frankly, comes down to nurses on the unit. And the nurses on the unit, my wife is a nurse, and I remember, she worked the ICU, and I would tell her, well, is it going to be a good day or a bad day? She knew exactly, kind of walking into that unit, just taking a look at the number of respirator patients they had, or, ECAG, or all these other types of technologies, that it was going to be a bad day, right? We're trying to be able to take that and take the subjectivity out of it and be able to be much more objective in kind of the approach. So the greatest, compliment or reward, I think, is, based on that estimate, is this right or wrong? Because frankly, a ratio is created how? I mean, what's the ground truth for the ratios that were created? What's the ground truth for a nurse going around and doing turns every 4 hours? Well, it's not there, right? It's been practice. So what we're trying to do is kind of drive that practice into an objective measure that will continue to be refined. And more importantly, what Carrie was saying is, like, now at least, I was a QA manager for many years, right? It's like, you can't do anything until you can measure it, right? Well, let's start with the measurements, understand where we are today, and then we can look at the process and procedures to be able to, continue to further improve it. So anyway, I guess that's a long-ended answer to say, you know what? We're trying to figure out what the actual ground truth is. But what I will tell you is, before we even began the project, we interviewed nurse leadership. We interviewed, folks that were actually doing the stuff, and they said, you know what? It's a really emotional thing. When I have to go and essentially negotiate for additional resources, right? When I know in my heart of hearts that I need another nurse here, or patients will be put at risk. Right? Well, now that takes all of that stuff out. They're now objecting to, listen, I need another nurse, right? Or maybe I don't need as many nurses as, we had predicted. We're hoping to be able to find and strike that balance.
Thank you for the question. Next up.
Hi, folks. Thanks for your presentation today. I'm curious about why you chose the title Responsible AI and Ethical ML. What you were just describing, I think, kind of hit on my question, because I'm thinking about interviews with nurses at the start. But I'm wondering if you can elaborate further as well.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. Mind if I take a
Go ahead.
second? Okay. So machine learning, AI, particularly with the latest stuff on like ChatGPT and all those other types of things, are kind of, everyone's talking about it. You saw perhaps even, in the New York Times, opinion pieces about, well, maybe we should just put, let's stop AI, right? Because it's just, without any type of parameters and guidelines and guardrails and stuff like that, it's just going to go, amok. Well, the fact of the matter is what we're doing here has to be explainable. Right? What we're doing, what we just explained to you, is exactly the approach that we're using. We're not hiding anything. We're not putting it in a black box. Right? So we're helping you understand how we're doing it. We're also identifying that, it doesn't meet all requirements all the time. Right? There's some features, for instance, out of the 50 different units that we ran, 39 of them are actually developing the model, right? Because some of the smaller units are just too small for us to be able to derive numbers, right, that would even give us a good predictive model to be able to support it. So, that transparency, explainability, all those components, right, are part of what we consider to be responsible AI. So although we're not, expressly talking about all that stuff now, all of the stuff we're talking about is available. And I think that, that's an exemplar of how other companies have to be able to approach this so that it's not mystical, it's not magical, right? Nurses have to be able to explain to their leadership why I want to use this, right? And does it work or not? I hope that makes sense.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? Got another one here?
Okay, so.
I think we have one more question.
Oh, sorry. I didn't.
Just a quick question. For the prediction-wise, what would be a brief target, brief optimal target to be how many days in advance be predicted?
How many what?
How many days in advance to be predicted for the assigning work is getting better?
Yeah, so we originally wanted to be able to match the prediction associated with the current supply side, the
scheduling
scheduling system,
framework,
which goes out 6 weeks in advance. We wanted to be able to match that. The nurses came back and said, you know, that's cool, guys. You can do, you know, don't kill yourself on that. The fact of the matter is, I just want to know what's happening in the next 12 hours, right? Help me understand and crack that nut first, right? And you know, but we've continued to iterate, and you know, and we feel comfortable about going out 6 weeks. The issue is how often is that going to be used? I'm not sure yet, right? I mean, right now it's a new tool, it's a new model, right, for these folks, and we'll continue to tune it. But you know, frankly, I mean, I would expect, you know, the further out we can get, the better the prediction could be, right, over time. And again, we're not done, right? There's going to be other data elements that we're going to be putting into the model that will, I am sure, going to continue to improve it.
And for the future uses, is there any plan to include some preference of the individuals for the assigning models, including like time shift or like some characteristic of individuals
Do you want to try
from
that?
the nursing staff?
So in other words, are we considering possibly nurse preference to the shifts and time frames? Let me try to answer it this way, and then you may have some comments. So what we discovered during this, what our hypothesis was that workload we talked about, the HPPD or hours per patient day, you calculate that, it's not flatline, right? When you look at it, and sure enough, the data showed us, because when we took into account all those orders, we have time, duration, frequency, and all that accounts for, and those come in blocks. We break it down into 4-hour increments, and those go up and down probably just as you would expect if you're in healthcare. And so what that allows us to do is think about, like what Carrie said, well, hey, maybe we can shift some of the workload and kind of, if you're familiar with the term level loading, maybe we can do some work there. But also, maybe we just have nurses who prefer to work that shift. And we've had a few of those cases happen where they actually said, hey, wait a minute, this is a really heavy hour on this unit, 4-hour period. If you'll work that 3 days a week, that's good. That's much better than leaving nursing and going home. I don't know that fully answers your question. Do you have anything that you'd want to add on that, Carrie?
No, that's exactly where my mind goes. So there's two different ways to approach it, and that is either level loading it or specifically looking at what are those specific hours. Right now, the tool is built to look at 4-hour blocks. I think even that mindset has to change a little bit, because really you need to just be, if we have the information to look 24 to 48 hours in advance, how do we actually look at where our pain points are to staff specifically to certain time periods, which is very different than what we've thought before.
Maybe related to your question is we still think we can pull in information from our HR system to show certifications and tenure of nurses and things like that will also help us inform what the match is, right?
Thank you very much for sharing so many things in details.
Yeah. Thank you. I think we've got 50 seconds left, so.
Yeah. Any more questions?
Thank you all for having us.
Thank you very much.
We appreciate it.